In a cancel culture, you have some people who believe that they are special, that they are superior, that they have the power to be able to shut down those who have ideas and views that are different.
Hi, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to Philosophy Insights. In this video, we look into the connection between cancel culture and political correctness. Even though both terms appear in similar contexts, their relation is rarely talked about and actually often misunderstood. We should start with an example of cancel culture as a reference about what we are talking about. So let us take the case of Kevin Hart. Hart was canceled at the Oscars in 2019. This case is really an important reference that should stick in our mind as a reminder about what the discussion is all about. The situation unfolded when Hart was announced as the host for the 2019 Oscars. Right after, it emerged that he had made several jokes about the LGBTQ+ community. But, and this is the crucial point, a decade earlier. The resurfacing of these tweets led to an immediate extreme backlash against him, with calls for the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences to remove him as host and with online threats to him as a person. Hart initially responded by noting that he had previously addressed these tweets and apologized, and therefore did not believe further action was necessary. He said that he believes now that these statements were a mistake and that he had grown since. However, the pressure continued to mount, and eventually, Hart announced that he was stepping down as Oscars host. This episode shows a few points very vividly. First, never apologize to the Twitter mob. It is only taken as an admission of guilt and does not stop cancel culture to run its course.
This is not the first time this has come up. I've addressed it. I've spoken on it. I've said where the rights and wrongs were. I've said who I am now versus who I was then. I've done it. I've done it. I'm not going to continue to go back and tap into the days of old when I moved on and I'm in a completely different space in my life. We feed in the internet trolls and we reward them. I'm not going to do it, man. I'm going to be me. I'm going to stand my ground.
Philosophically, the problem is that cancel culture leaves no room for growth or redemption. Kevin Hart had, prior to the Oscars controversy, already addressed his past jokes, labeled them as problematic, and discussed his personal growth since that time. A society that values personal development and forgiveness should acknowledge such growth rather than punishing past misdeeds that have already been acknowledged and apologized for. Furthermore, the ability to speak freely, including making jokes that might be in poor taste, should be under the protection of free expression. Humor often involves pushing boundaries, and comedians like Hart are particularly at risk of censorship under the current cultural climate.
David Pakman is this liberal, progressive guy. This woman posts on Twitter she would never vote for a man or a white man or a white person, white or male, someone who's white or male. He says that's racist and sexist. It is. So she blocks him on Twitter. Today she called Boston College demanding that they not have him back as adjunct faculty. It's crazy. So this woman posts this, and he points out that it's racist and sexist. So she blocks him, and she tries to get him fired.
One also has to be wary of the mob mentality facilitated by platforms like Twitter, where individuals can be judged and sentenced without due process or a fair hearing. The rapid spread of outrage, often amplified without context, has very often led to disproportionate consequences. Finally, there is a broader worry about the chilling effect of such incidents on the arts and entertainment industries. The fear of potential backlash will lead artists and creators to self-censor, limiting the range of expressions and ideas explored in these fields. This can stifle creativity, leading to a bland cultural landscape that avoids risk.
For cancel culture, it gives malevolent Machiavellians the opportunity to bully in a manner that destroys reputations without repercussion, and so there's no shortage of fun in that.
So, given this background, how does cancel culture relate to political correctness? Cancel culture has in fact emerged as an extreme extension of political correctness in the digital age. It represents a community-driven form of social sanction against individuals or organizations whose actions or statements are deemed unacceptable or offensive. This practice often plays out on social media platforms, where the speed and anonymity of the internet facilitates rapid public judgments and reactions. Political correctness and cancel culture influence each other through a feedback loop. Here's how this works. Heightened sensitivity to offensive language and behaviors, stemming from an adherence to politically correct norms, feeds into the triggers for cancel culture actions. Conversely, the fear of being canceled can intensify the policing of language and behavior, pushing the boundaries of political correctness even further. Once a so-called offense is perceived and publicized, particularly on social media, cancel culture mechanisms kick in. These mechanisms often involve public shaming or calls for punitive actions against the individual or entity deemed offensive. The rapid, public nature of these reactions can create a spectacle, drawing even more attention and scrutiny. This spectacle, in turn, feeds back into the realm of political correctness by setting new precedents for what is considered acceptable or unacceptable. Usually, the incidents are, therefore, viewed as prime examples of how the new standards of political correctness should be applied, and this leads to a tightening of the norms and expectations around language and behavior. The new norms, in turn, will then be used to cancel more speakers and creating new precedents. In this feedback loop, the norms established by political correctness become increasingly stringent, and the actions taken by proponents of cancel culture become more normalized. Furthermore, the whole process is then institutionalist. Organizations, in an attempt to avoid public relations disasters, implement stricter and stricter codes of conduct and speech guidelines that adhere to the most rigid interpretations of political correctness. This institutional response then solidifies the cycle, embedding it within the structural and policy frameworks of societies and organizations.
A woman named Sarah Jiang, I hope I'm saying that right, who was recently hired to the advisory board of the editorial component of the New York Times, the newspaper of record of sorts for the West, sad as that may be. She too had a lot of incendiary tweets in her background, some very silly stuff, but some very malicious and nasty stuff. And so in this instance, the right wing got active and busy on social media, going after her and blasting her. But the difference was, of course, that the New York Times said, no, we hear what you're saying, but we looked back at those tweets, we talked to her about it. She doesn't believe that stuff anymore, and we're going to have her at the New York Times. We're not going to let the mob win. And frankly, I don't care if Sarah Jiang is on the New York Times editorial board. I don't take New York Times editorials with any seriousness whatsoever. And so it's of no concern to me. And I'm kind of glad they stood up, to be frank. I think that this is a good thing. I would like to see more organizations doing that, saying, no, we're going to have her. And more importantly, to be fair, I think that some of the sentiments she voiced in those tweets are what a lot of folks on the left actually think. They might not just be so polite as to say them publicly. But here's the thing, is both Sarah Jiang and Kevin Williamson are going to be A-OK. They are mildly famous people with mildly successful careers who will go on to do other things in their lives if for some reason the New York Times, or in Kevin Williamson's case, the Atlantic, didn't work out. These are people with probably a little bit of money and some name ID and some opportunities out there in the world. But not everybody is like that. So I'd like to bring up an anecdote that has a little different ending, particularly with respect to a couple of friends of mine. One of them's name is Daniel McAdams. He heads up the Ron Paul Institute in Texas, which is a very anti-interventionist, anti-war small group. And Scott Horton. Scott Horton is also a libertarian activist, very anti-war, and wrote a book called Fool's Errand, which really documents what I agree with, some of you may not, foolishness in terms of our never-ending longest war in human history, in U.S. history, in Afghanistan, a war on which we spent trillions of dollars. So anyway, both of these gentlemen got kicked off Twitter earlier this week. They were involved in a spat with another Twitterer and saying some things back and forth, and they defended a guy who was saying something like, I hope the Trump zombies come eat you, or something like that. And so somebody got upset and said, well, this violates Twitter's terms of service. You ought to ban these guys because they're threatening violence. No one was threatening violence. But nonetheless, they were both kicked off Twitter. And for people who really operate on very little money, people who operate at the margins of public discourse, a platform like Twitter is very valuable, very, very valuable to them. and it's no longer available. So, you know, the state didn't come along and say, Scott Horton and Danny McAdams, you can't say that. If you continue to say that, we're going to fine you. Uncle Sam is going to fine you, or your state or county is going to fine you. The government didn't come along and say, we're going to put you in jail if you don't stop yammering about the war in Afghanistan. None of that happened. But in a sense, their lives and the lives of some other people who have been attacked on social media actually did get smaller. If we think about it, when someone goes to jail, they're literally in a cage, and they can't have any contact with their friends and family, they can't work, etc. So we've really contained their life and made it smaller. But to a lesser extent, we're kind of doing that with these social media outrage mobs. We're not putting people in jail, but we might be diminishing their lives, making their lives smaller in terms of their career opportunities, the money they might make, their circle of friends, their circle of influence. These things shrink. So they're not in jail, but they did get smaller. So there's certainly a punishment element to it.
And here you have it, the relation between cancel culture and political correctness. What do you think about this relation? Tell us in the comments and subscribe and hit that bell for more content like this.